Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. So the countdown is on. 6 weeks, 42 days of campaigning to go until the general election. Now, whatever surprise there was around yesterday, around the 4th of July date, we've no time to dwell on that because the campaigns have already started. Rishi Sunak has been out speaking this morning, doing a round of interviews, doing his first campaign events as well. The orange high-vis jackets are out already. Someone prepared that, even if they didn't have an umbrella yesterday. Sunak revealing the deportation flights to Rwanda won't happen before the elections. There's an interesting point to one of those big policies already we're getting. And as for him getting drenched in front of Downing Street, his argument is he's not a fair weather politician, and that shows it.
Oh, ho, ho. Will that wash with the electorate? How many more of these gags will we have? Look, you're right. There's no time for the dust to settle. Labour's already unveiled its campaign placards. They're bright red and they've just got a massive word on it, change. And then Nigel Farage, there's lots of anticipation also about reform and the event that they held today. Farage saying that he won't stand as an MP. He's honorary president of the Reform Party. He's more focused on the US presidential race. This election, though, overall, and this is why I'm sort of rubbing my hands with glee in some senses, it's probably going to be dominated by the economy, by living standards. But we've also had 4 elections in less than 10 years, plus the Brexit referendum, plus the Indy referendum. There is certainly a bit of a sense, I think, about British voter weariness. Yeah,
weariness too with, the string of relatively bad economic news too. And the situation in the economy, we know that, inflation's coming down, but prices are still high and people are feeling the pinch of that. So we want to dig into this idea of how central a role the economy is going to play in the campaigns, how the parties are going to be framing the different pieces of data, putting their own spin on how they feel the economy is doing. Of course, we have still the memories of the Liz Truss mini budget. We know that Labour are going to want to talk about that. The Conservatives will focus on stability and the unknowns of what a Labour government might bring. Very different time to a 2019 election dominated by the 3 words, get Brexit done.
Oh, yes, that's a while ago. But look, will all of these messages cut through? How will the digital campaign be different this time around? Everything is so online too. Joining us now to shed some light on how an economy-focused election will play out on the campaign trail, we have Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics and Government, and our Associate Editor Ailbhe Rea with us. Welcome to both of you. So delighted to have you on. Stephanie, can I just ask you firstly what you think? Who better to tell us and explain, first of all, actually just how well the UK, or how badly the UK economy is really doing? It's our bread and butter. It's the statistics.
Yes, and I think, obviously, and you heard it actually in the Prime Minister's interviews today, and our start of the campaign, that there is an ability to cherry pick, which they're taking advantage of. So both the Chancellor and he are talking about the quite good, unexpectedly good growth figures for just the first 3 months of this year. And obviously the fact that inflation has moved back much closer to target. We heard this week it was about 2.3% in the last month. Now that sort of sounds okay, but of course, if you don't have to sort of widen the lens very far to find a pretty stagnant performance for the economy. We've barely grown over the last couple of years. And I think crucially, and this was put together very nicely by our chief UK economist, Dan Hansen, today, you have the lowest increase in living standards on record over this parliament. And I think that alone, in real terms, thanks to the squeeze that inflation has put on people's finances, I think that is the thing that they're going to be struggling with throughout the campaign, even if they talk about these rosy figures for the last month and last few months. And the Prime Minister was citing how it was stronger than the US, but it's pretty much the only time that we've grown fast, the only quarter in which we've grown faster than the US for quite a long time. And the difference between us, even in the last 12 months, is the difference between 0.2% growth by us and 3% by the US.
So that's some of the economic context. Ailbhe, I'd like to bring you in at this point to talk about the politics around how the parties are talking about the economy too. If you look at the YouGov polling on voters' trust in the economy, shows that it fell under Boris Johnson, again under Liz Truss. Have Labour managed to sort of put a stamp on them being a party that can be trustworthy with the economy?
Yes, they have, and this is really important for them. So since Rachel Reeves became Shadow Chancellor in 2021, she's been telling colleagues that Labour has only ever won a general election when it has polled better than the Conservatives on economic credibility. It's actually one of the best indicators of who's going to win the general election. And that's in a context where this is quite often a weakness for Labour. After 2019, Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, they weren't seen as credible on the economy. And also since the economic crash, that's a while ago now, but Labour has still felt haunted by this sense that there was no money left after they were last in government, and it still occasionally comes up on doorsteps. So for the past few years, they have really, really scrupulously just tried to sort of knock voters over the head with this idea that they can be trusted with the public finances. Everything will be scrupulously costed, and that often means Rachel Reeves saying no to colleagues who want funding for their own projects.
Stephanie, how much do you think that Rishi Sunak and that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, can change things, turn things around in the minds of voters over the next 6 weeks? I mean, Sunak has talked about voters needing to stick with the plan when it comes to the economy, even though Hunt has kind of acknowledged that a lot of voters do feel quite bruised and battered, in his words, about the economic shocks that the UK has experienced.
I mean, it is interesting because it's a challenge that we see even more starkly, in a sense, in President Biden's campaign in the US, where by any measure the US economy has done much better than other countries, and even there, because people feel so squeezed, inflation has had such a toxic effect on people's feeling of their own well-being, even when their wages have actually kept up, and that's been true here as well in the last year or so. Wages have actually kept up with inflation, so in theory, people aren't worse off, but they feel worse off every time they look at that gas bill or that, all those bills that are now much higher. The fact that, their weekly grocery shop is the sticker shock of, how much that costs. I think politicians everywhere have just underestimated how much that lingers. And the fact that inflation is not still going up doesn't buy you as much as you might have hoped. And you certainly don't necessarily get a lot of credit for having pushed it down. So I think they will struggle even without, a lot of the other criticisms that will be levelled over the chaos, the many prime ministers, all the sort of incompetence of the managing of the prisons, whatever, all these other things that appear to be going wrong. Even on that core message, I think making people, it goes back to that classic line, Labour's going to take us back to square one. It's the first election I can remember where for a lot of people, square one will seem like quite an attractive place to go.
Absolutely. I think the best line that I've read about that phenomenon, about inflation being so frustrating to voters, is that workers feel when their pay packet goes up, oh, well, that's all me, that's my hard work. But when prices in the supermarkets go up, it's, somebody else sort of putting the prices up and taking away from me. So, yeah, it's difficult.
I would say this, and this is a journalistic thing as well, that when I was at the BBC and I was, you would be sent out to a supermarket on a day where food prices had fallen, by 20%, say, and you would never be able to find anyone admit that any prices had gone down at all. They always felt like costs were going up. And as you say, any wage increase, that's on them.
And then, of course, the framing of all of this is that a lot of voters who don't know terribly much about economics in general just blame this on Liz Truss and her management of the economy. Labour was in the lead a bit under Boris Johnson after Partygate, but it began to lead in the polls by 20 points when we had Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. And Tories would say privately now, even people around Rishi Sunak, that they just feel like they haven't been able to get a hearing from voters since that point. There's just this top line, this feeling that the Tories crashed the economy. Even though global factors have played into that too, it all now feels pinned on this government.
And to an extent, that's a success of the Labour Party's messaging, because they've been banging that drum for a while now. That kind of begs the question of then, if we're heading into an election where public finances are so constrained, is there any money this time around is kind of a relevant question. Alva, how does the Labour Party, I suppose, try to inspire hope that they can make change if there's a very bare cupboard to look in?
I think that word inspire is very interesting because there is actually a little bit of a split in Labour. I mean, they're all quite happy at the moment, doing so well in the polls, and they all want to be in government. But there is a split on their strategy, and there has been for the past few years. Some of them want to focus on stability and being reassuring first and foremost because of that importance of economic credibility. Others want to have a more inspiring message, quite simply. So, on team stability, you have people like Rachel Reeves, some of the people around Keir Starmer and Pat McFadden, their campaign's chief. And then in the change camp, you would have people more like Angela Rayner and Ed Miliband. And essentially, the stability people have won. So they are still trying to be a bit inspiring. We're seeing the word change on a lot of their campaigning materials. But ultimately their first step is economic stability, not even economic growth, because they want to reassure people first and foremost that they can be trusted not to do anything that will cause jitters, nothing like Liz Truss, just to be a safe pair of hands.
Okay. Stephanie, how difficult will it be to improve the UK economy after the election? I was speaking, for example, to Michael Saunders, former Bank of England official, just this morning. He was saying that there are some things you can do, like getting closer economic trade ties with the EU, building more houses. What do you think the day after the election is going to happen potentially?
Well, I mean, I think also goes back to the timing of the election. I mean, no one, we don't know what was going on inside the Prime Minister's brain, but it's becoming clear that there was going to be very little space for any tax cuts in the autumn. And that's because the leeway that the Chancellor had in March, that at the time we said was kind of, wafer thin, that his leeway for still meeting that rather silly target of having the debt falling in the fifth year of the forecast. So it always gets further forward. In order to meet that, it looked like he had a sort of £9 billion of headroom, which is not very much at all. We actually think that is based on, although it looks very low, it's actually based on a pretty optimistic forecast for UK potential growth, for productivity growth, output per head. We've been really bad over the last few years at making more stuff with the same number of people, and that is really the only way that you raise GDP and living standards over the long term. We actually think that very soon now the Office for Budget Responsibility is going to have to lower its forecast, because at the moment it's expecting productivity growth to be twice as fast in the next 10 years as it's been in the last 10 years. And although that's still not a very impressive number, it's, we think, too high. So Michael Saunders is absolutely right. Anything you can do, I mean, that change, if you change from 1.1, which is what the OBR are forecasting for productivity growth, we think it's more like 0.6. That's been the average over the last 10 years. If you could get it up to 1.1, I mean, that's a £45 billion difference in the public finances, which we think is a hole currently. But if you were able to sort of change the outlook for trade, because we've had this big decline in the tradable sector thanks to a very tough Brexit, if move the dial on housing and particularly on sort of ability to do lifting of planning restrictions, all of those things, it would make a difference. But gosh, it's not going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years.
And probably not in the next 6 weeks either. Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics and Government, and our Associate Editor Ailbhe Rea. Thank you to you both for joining us. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You should also, by the way, subscribe to Stephanie's Votonomics podcast. Yeah, absolutely. This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker. And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Tuesday. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.